Hello, RotoBallers! This is the Fantasy Championship. Ready your breakfast and eat hearty. This week we dine on fantasy glory. Here are my starts and sits at the wide receiver and quarterback positions for week number 17. First up, those wide receivers. The number one wide receiver that I'm firing up this week is Rashee Rice versus Cincinnati. The Bengals just allowed Mason Rudolph to guide that George Pickens fantasy sleigh last week, allowing him to have 195 yards and a pair of touchdown grabs on just 4 catches. And over the last 4 weeks, the Bengals have allowed 790 receiving yards and 5 scores to opposing wide receivers, which adds up to the 4th most fantasy points to the position over that time. As for Rice, since week 12, Mahomes has targeted Rice 28.2% of the time, and Rice has not had fewer than 11.5 fantasy points in any of those 5 Chiefs contests, while averaging 18.6 fantasy points per game as the wide receiver 5 over the last 5 weeks. The second wide receiver you can feel good about this week is Chris Olave taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This one has all the makings to becoming a fantasy shootout. Look, I love myself some Mike Evans and Chris Godwin as much as anyone, but right now the biggest fantasy producer this week is likely to be Chris Olave, whom Derek Carr targeted 13 times last Thursday, helping Olave to a 23-point fantasy performance, and that was on a bad ankle. Olave, he's averaging 17.9 fantasy points per game over his last 4 contests, which is the 10th most fantasy points per game by a wide receiver since week number 12. Now, Olave has also hit double-digit fantasy production in 8 of his last 9 contests, and with a battle against a Bucs team that is allowing nearly 38 fantasy points per game last month, this is a must-start. And my third wide receiver you're firing up this week is Nico Collins versus the Tennessee Titans. He made his return to your fantasy lineups last week, and while he didn't necessarily do a whole heck of a lot, he still found his way into the end zone and 13 fantasy points. You know Houston was happy to get Collins back in the lineup as he has seen 3 targets inside the 5-yard line over the last 4 weeks, and that includes missing that week 15 contest. Collins also sits 4th amongst pass catchers when we're talking about yards per route run this season, averaging 2.78 per. But what makes Collins a must-start option this week here in your fantasy championship? It is the fact that not only are the Titans allowing the 5th most fantasy points this season to wide receivers, but C.J. Stroud appears to be on target to make his return after missing the last 2 weeks. Now let's talk about wide receivers that we're sitting, and we have to start with Kelvin Ridley versus Carolina. Again, this is more of a knock on the person responsible for delivering the ball to Ridley than Ridley himself. After all, Ridley did just finish last week with 90 receiving yards and a pair of scores, but injuries to his quarterback continue to add up. The injuries to the other weapons in this offense, they're continuing to pile up as well. If the Jaguars want to win this week, they may attempt to take the ball out of Trevor Lawrence's hand and put it into the hands of Travis Etienne, who faces a Panthers defense that has allowed a league-high 18 rushing touchdowns and the 5th most rushing yards this season. The second wide receiver that I'm sitting this week, and I hate to do this, but it's Stefon Diggs versus New England. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm following the numbers here, and the numbers, they don't look good. Diggs is currently the wide receiver 8 in PPR format, so that's great. But since week number 10, he sits as the wide receiver 51, averaging just 9.3 fantasy points per game, and he has only got 1 game over that 7-week period in which he has topped 10 fantasy points. It's also hard to ignore that over the last 6 contests, he has been held to 35 or fewer receiving yards on 4 occasions after being held to that total just twice in the previous 58 contests. Of note, New England has allowed the 11th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers over their previous 4 weeks. That math doesn't look good. The third wide receiver that I'm just not feeling, it's T. Higgins versus the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs are allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points to receivers over the last 4 weeks. Then again, Aiden O'Connell didn't really need to complete any passes after the first quarter last week. Jake Browning, he hooked up with Higgins 5 times last week for 140 yards, but it's not just Higgins that he's focusing on. The Chiefs, they're going to be focused on Higgins, but Browning, he has been spreading around this ball better than any quarterback in recent memory here, which makes his ceiling a little bit lower. As for that quarterback position, here we go. You're starting Matthew Stafford once again as he's taking on the New York Giants. Only Jalen Hurts has produced more fantasy points than Stafford's 110 since week number 12. This week, Stafford faced a Giants defense that is allowing the 2nd most fantasy production over last month to quarterbacks, allowing 18.4 per contest. So what we have here is a defense that is allowing 20 fantasy points per game, a quarterback who's averaging 22 fantasy points per game over his last 5 battles. The math here would suggest that a reasonable outcome would be a 20-plus fantasy performance in your fantasy football finals. Number 2 quarterback this week I feel good about, it's the return of Brock Purdy versus Washington. Look, last week was the good, the bad, and the not so Purdy as the Ravens defense made the once front-running MVP candidate look rather pedestrian. Bad news for the 49ers, Brock Purdy, he suffered a little bit of a stinger there, but pretty much every lineman was banged up at some point. The good news is Washington traded all their pass rushers, so that doesn't really matter, and he's going to be throwing against a secondary that has allowed 4,000 yards through the air and a league-high 33 passing touchdowns on the season. As for the quarterbacks you're sitting, I do not feel good about Tua Tagovailoa going against that Ravens defense. We all saw what happened on Monday Night Football as Week 16 came to a close, right? Watching that Ravens defense fly around out there, picking off Brock Purdy on 4 occasions. No team has allowed fewer than the 11.3 fantasy points per game that the Ravens had yielded this season, nor does any team have more than the 54 sacks in which this defense has recorded. Only the 49ers and the Ravens have forced more interceptions this season than passing touchdowns allowed. Yeah, that's not good, Bob. The second quarterback that I have no desire in starting this week is Trevor Lawrence versus Carolina. I'm not sure how Lawrence is still standing at this point. In the last few weeks, he suffered a high ankle sprain there, a concussion, a shoulder injury, which forced him to exit last week's contest. If Lawrence does find a way to play, he's still without Christian Kirk, he's without Zay Jones, and he's facing a Carolina Panthers team that is allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks and the 3rd fewest throughout the season. And the final quarterback you're sitting is Joe Flacco versus the New York Jets. The Joe Flacco story has been fantastic. That said, this Jets team has allowed a league-low 8.2 fantasy points per game to the position over the last 4 weeks. They've conceded just 600 passing yards. Now, you may say, hey, how do I sit a quarterback who's thrown for 311, 374, and 368 yards, along with 8 touchdowns over the last 3 weeks? Those games came against teams ranked 25th or worse when it comes to pass defense. The Jets are the 2nd best. Once again, this video is being recorded on Tuesday, so plenty can still happen between now and Sunday's kickoffs. So check out RotoBaller.com and the RotoBaller Discord channel for all the latest fantasy football news. Thanks again for tuning in, and be sure to hit that like and subscribe button so you do not miss any of the great fantasy football analysis right here on the RotoBaller YouTube channel.